The Medici. Catherine de Medici, Part 1.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Catherine de Medici, Part 1. Born 1519, married 1533, died 1589. 1. The first 40 years of her life. Modern history has requirements of which former generations seldom dreamt. In former days, the method which as a rule commended itself to both writer and reader was one by which characters in history were labeled as bad or good, and little attempt made at any further discrimination. The fact was lost sight of that, since real characters are more complex than this, such a method produces figures unlike any men or women who ever lived, and so gives us distorted views of history. Again, while much more information is available now than formerly, it is also coming to be seen that actions belonging to a bygone age must be judged upon a different principle to that hitherto en vogue. Thus, a writer of our time has pointed out that, while with a former generation it was natural to lavish indiscriminate condemnation upon all characters in history who took a different course to that which would now be taken by any one, modern conceptions of the proper attitude of mind in one who deals with history require him to strive to enter impartially to the feelings of all his characters. In order to avoid that tendency to create impossible figures which is so severely condemned by the modern view of the matter, and arrive at that more discriminate estimate of historical characters now deemed imperative, probably no requirement is more essential than that we should put ourselves mentally into the atmosphere of the time, and carefully guard against judging such characters by the standards of our own age, in which persons live and act under totally different conditions, instead of in relation to the opinions and conditions of their day. Looked at in the latter way, those who were in advance of the moral standard of their time, and those who were behind it, will both be correctly judged, but neither of them will be so if the standard employed is that of our own age. The foregoing considerations are more important in the case of Catherine de Medici than perhaps of any other figure in history. For we have in her case an exceptional combination of incentives to the production of a fictitious character. In the first place, the marriage arranged for her by Clement VII in his scheme for outwitting Charles V produced a rooted prejudice against her from the very first in the minds of the French, who felt that in her person the honor of the nation had received a grievous insult, it being a galling wound to French amour-propre that the son of their king should marry one of bourgeois extraction. This feeling steadily increased among the French people, whose favorite name for her was the Italian woman, growing from prejudice into hatred, and causing the contemporary French writers to credit her with numberless crimes, so that in fact, says a modern French writer, it would seem from them that scarcely any crime could be committed in any part of France without it being attributed in some way to Catherine de Medici. The result has been to make any reliable account of her actions practically unobtainable from them. But this is not all. The intense prejudice caused by this wound to national pride would alone have sufficed to furnish us with a record from the contemporary French writers, calculated to produce a very false picture of the person concerned. But to this were subsequently added two other influences tending in the same direction, that is, the effects of a bitter religious conflict calling forth animosities which knew no bounds in attributing every crime and evil motive to religious opponents, and the delight in tales of crime felt to an unusual degree by the people of that age. Seldom have three such powerful inducements for the production of a fictitious character be combined in connection with one individual, and this combination of national prejudice, religious animosity, and appetite for sensation produced a result in the case of Catherine de Medici surpassing anything of the kind to be seen elsewhere. The consequence has been that a character has been presented to us which was a radical impossibility. We were asked to believe that it was possible for a woman to have governed an important state for nearly 30 years, enacted many excellent measures for the better administration of justice, intervened constantly between enemies anxious to destroy each other, been throughout life a peacemaker, saved the lives of persons who were her opponents, been greatly liked by various persons of unimpeachable character, and been at the end of her life sufficiently respected by the people of Paris, even when they were in a state of violent rebellion, to be able to pass unprotected through the barricaded streets when no one else could do so, and yet at the same time to have been a prodigy of duplicity and crime, committing murders wholesale. And such a combination being so completely incongruous, it is not surprising that we find a modern French writer saying, "Catherine de Medici has been so greatly disfigured as to make her, so to say, unrecognizable, a phantasmagoric personage." The gradual publication, however, of the state papers of various countries, including Catherine's own voluminous correspondence, is slowly dispelling the errors which this cloud of misrepresentation has gathered round her, with the result that the traditional view about her is slowly giving place to a more correct estimate of her character and actions. 3 things are necessary in order to estimate the character of Catherine de Medici correctly. First, to measure 16th century actions by 16th century standards of thought and opinion, and not by those of the 20th century. Second, to give the same weight to facts which tell in her favor as to those which tell against her, as would be done in a court of law. Third, to look with very close scrutiny at any argument which urges that some action of hers in itself praiseworthy should not be held to be so in her case, since it was merely an artifice of duplicity, and to require corroborative testimony of facts in support of all such statements. The course commonly adopted has been the exact reverse of this. It has been that of measuring her actions by the standard, not of her time, but of ours, of giving full weight to, and even exaggerating, all that tells against her, while giving little weight to actions telling in her favor, on the ground that she was a mass of indifference, or in some other way devoid of the feelings which ordinarily prompt such actions, all of which is pure assumption. And, lastly, where this course is inapplicable, of declaring such actions to be due to duplicity. All this has been done in order to avoid a certain dilemma which occurs in Catherine's case, caused by the fact that a person whom it is considered necessary to portray as a villain has to be credited with a number of actions incompatible with that hypothesis, so that, unless these are explained away, there is produced a figure which is palpably an impossible one. And yet, after all, this dilemma has not been avoided. Again and again, by writer after writer, we find Catherine called an enigma, a paradox, a mystery, or declared to unite in her character the most discordant and contradictory qualities. And even writers who have been most painstaking in investigating the details of her life have nonetheless felt themselves impelled to use these terms in an endeavor to escape from this dilemma. But an impossible character is not made less impossible by calling it an enigma, so that this still leaves the dilemma unremoved. Catherine de Medici is an enigma only to those who start from the basis that she was a villain, and having taken that as an axiom, then find, however much is explained away, that there remain various qualities in her, and actions done by her, which fit so ill with that axiom that all attempt to reconcile the two has to be abandoned. But those who, divesting their minds of the preconceived ideas implanted by the biased writers of a time of abnormally bitter conflict, judge Catherine's character as it is now revealed in the fuller light available from the state papers of various countries, who measure her actions in due relation to the conditions and standards of her time, and lastly, who take equally into consideration the light shades with the dark, will find Catherine de Medici no enigma at all, but a character, remarkable indeed for energy, ability, and other striking qualities, but yet thoroughly harmonious and easy to understand. Not perhaps so well adapted for sensational methods of treatment, but at all events real, a living character, not an impossible phantom. It is remarkable to see in how many ways Catherine shows herself a true representative of the family of whose elder branch she was the last descendant. The abnormal ability and energy, the love of learning, fondness for field sports, artistic taste, common sense, power to sway those brought into contact with her, and love of ruling, due to the conscious possession of superior powers, all these characteristics which had been prominent in her ancestors appear again in fullest strength in her. It is also evident that she had much of that same many-sided character which we have seen recorded of in her great-grandfather Lorenzo the Magnificent, and seen described as so difficult for the northern races of Europe to understand, and as often causing him, too, to be styled by them, with as little reason, an enigma and a mystery. Coming to other points more strictly personal to herself, the first we notice is that she was undoubtedly cold and unimpassioned. And she had need to be so, if she was to survive to the age of 70 in a position of authority in such a stormy time as was hers. In this she is the counterpart of two other prominent women of her age, Queen Elizabeth of England and Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre. At the same time, it may be doubted whether Catherine had as much of this quality as either of the other two, and whether a great part of the appearance which she presented, of a cold and unimpassioned nature, was not due to her abnormal power of self-control. It is admitted by all authorities that her love for her husband, Henry II, was intense, and that his indifference to her was the great grief of her life, while her affection, in her youth for the nuns of the Murate convent, in middle age for her son Henry, and in old age for her daughter-in-law Louise de Vaudemont, and her granddaughter Christine of Lorraine, shows that she was not incapable of such feelings. Many accounts credit her with marked love for her children, but, with the exception of her son Henry, it may be doubted whether these statements are not mere courtly flatteries. She was exceedingly careful of her children's health and training, but there it would seem to have ended, and she at times treated them with great harshness. But most prominent of all the features in Catherine's character were the allied qualities of prudence and self-control. This self-control was in her developed to a degree which bordered upon the marvellous, being such as has been seen in few other individuals. It is constantly referred to as amazing all around her. With it was combined a no less frequently mentioned prudence, by which term the writers of that day implied a good deal more than the meaning which we now attach to it. But in her it was, so to say, a prudence run mad, a prudence which had been allowed to absorb all other faculties. All thoughts, all feelings, all desires were, with an iron will, drilled into subjection to this prudence, this unsleeping, incessant care at all times, in all places, under all circumstances, to look, to do, and to speak only that which would advance the matter in hand. Her daughter, the Princess Marguerite, who stood in much awe of her, speaks of her as "she from whose soul prudence was never parted, who moderated her actions according to her desire, demonstrating plainly that a discreet person doeth nothing he willeth not to do." This feature in Catherine's character was the outcome, as will be seen, of an unusually severe trial lasting for many years. She was not always like this, but she grew to be so under the peculiar conditions of her life from the age of 20 to that of 40. And it is this rigid prudence and self-control which makes us feel her to be so unhuman. She appears to have, in one sense, neither faults nor virtues, and to be as flawless and as unattractive as a bar of finely tempered steel. As has been said, it was the force of dire conditions which fashioned Catherine the emotional girl, possessed of sweetness of disposition and amiable ways, into Catherine the prudent and icy woman. But though it was her misfortune, not her fault, it gave her a characteristic which is perhaps most of all resented by mankind. It is, however, a mistake to imagine that Catherine was a person of stone. The best judges of her conduct were not the French, but the ambassadors of other powers living at the court of France, especially those of Venice, and from the recently published Venetian state papers and the very full reports which the Venetian ambassadors in succession furnished to their government of all these events, we obtain invaluable information by which to judge of all such points. Thus, for instance, on this point of her outward appearance of indifference and want of feeling, the Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Correr, in one of his reports to his government, writes, "I know that she hath often been found weeping in her chamber, but she at once dried her eyes and dissembled her sadness, and in order to mislead those who estimated the state of affairs by the expression of her countenance, she wore a calm and joyous aspect when abroad." Although we find some, even among those Protestant writers who hated her with a rancorous hatred, speaking of her astonishing evenness of temper, she had in reality a hot, though not revengeful, temper. But her abnormal power of self-control never suffered this to appear when it would interfere in any way with her object. When, however, this was not the case, her wrath could show itself in a manner terrifying to those around her. The Princess Marguerite, describing one of these outbursts, says, "Elle jetait feu, et disait tout ce qu'une colère outrée et démesurée peut jeter dehors." Another trait in Catherine, inherited from ancestors who were Florentine citizens, among whom this quality was, and still is, greatly prized, was a never-failing bonhomie, a spirit always ready with a laugh, a joke, and a cheerful countenance, even in the midst of hardships and misfortunes. Her attainments were of a high order. She was well read and accomplished. She brought to France that love of learning and art inherent in her family. She took a special interest in science, while evidence of her innate artistic taste was in after years furnished by Fontainebleau, Chenonceau, the Louvre, the Tuileries, and every other palace which she occupied. Other qualities which we find constantly mentioned are her great personal courage, power of enduring physical pain without showing any sign, and agreeable manners. The remaining features of her character will be more conveniently considered when we come to look at her as ruler of France. As regards her appearance, the chief points which we find noted by contemporary historians are her broad forehead, fine hair, fine eyes, beautiful hands, and tall, graceful figure. Her life divides itself into 3 well-marked periods, that is, 14 years of girlhood, 26 years of married life, and 30 years of widowhood, during the greater part of which she was the all-powerful Queen Regent of France. First period, 1519 to 1533. Catherine, the only child of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, and his young wife, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, was born in the Medici Palace on the 13th April 1519, and at her baptism was given the names of Catherine Maria Romola. She is well called in history Catherine de Medici, For while she was the last of that elder branch of the Medici which had had such a great career, in her all the mental capacity of her family, which her father and grandfather had failed to show, reappeared as strongly as ever, and in this its latest descendant Cosimo's branch showed no smallest sign of deterioration. When Catherine was born, her father, her mother, her grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini, and her father's aunt, Maddalena Cibo, all lay dying, the two former at the Medici Palace, and the two latter at the villa of Careggi. Catherine's mother died a fortnight after her daughter's birth, and her father 6 days later, while Maddalena Cibo and Alfonsina Orsini both died shortly afterwards. The orphan baby was thus left without any near relations, except her aunt, Clarice Strozzi, who was in Rome, and she remained in charge of servants, a solitary little scion of the nearly extinguished family in that Medici palace, which had again become too large a house for so small a family. Ariosto, touched by the friendless condition of this lonely little flower, round which so many rough winds blew, wrote at this time regarding her, speaking as for Florence, «Verdeggia un ramo sol con poca foglia, e fratema esperanza to sospesa, se lo milaschi inverno non lo mitaglia». Being the sole heiress of the possessions and claims of the Medici family, this baby girl was a small person of much importance. On her father's death, her distant relative, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, came to Florence to take charge of the government and of herself. We have seen the far-reaching schemes which he formed regarding her future and that of the family, and the use that he would make of this orphan girl to advance the latter. And we have seen in what some of those schemes resulted. But we have now to look at Catherine herself, and at her life from the time when she first looked on the world from the windows of the Medici Palace in the Via Larga, Florence. Her childhood was passed in the midst of stormy episodes, the rage of furious mobs, the clash of arms and the sound of guns. When she was 6 months old she was taken to Rome, a difficult journey for a baby in those days, and performed by her probably in a pannier on a mule's back, and was placed by her grand-uncle, Leo X, in the charge of her aunt, Clarice Strozzi. She remained at Rome till she was 6, by which time Cardinal Giulio had become Pope Clement VII, and the commotions were beginning which ended in the sack of the Vatican. As, therefore, Rome was becoming too disturbed a residence, she was, in 1525, sent back to Florence to her home in the Medici Palace, where she was placed under the charge of Cardinal Passerini, at that time governing Florence in the Medici interest, and in whose charge were also the 2 boys of 16 and 14, Ippolito and Alessandro, the former much liked, but the latter cordially detested, by the 6-year-old Catherine. For the next 2 years Catherine remained amidst these surroundings, lessons in the various subjects then considered necessary for every well-born girl, occupying most of her time, varied by frequent battles with Alessandro, the quarrels between the two becoming at last so pronounced that Alessandro was sent away to live at the villa of Poggio a Caiano. Then, when Catherine was 8 years old, there took place in Rome the catastrophe of 1527, and news reached Florence that the papal city had been taken and sacked, and awful horrors perpetrated, and that the Pope was being besieged in the castle of St. Angelo. The consternation in the Medici Palace was great, especially as it was soon known that the Signoria had assembled and were debating whether Florence should revolt from Pope Clement and banish the Medici family. And that might mean death, or at least much danger and hardship, and the palace would almost certainly be plundered of everything by the mob, as it was. And to what city could they go, since both Rome and all places in the papal dominions and in the Tuscan state would be barred to them? These questions Cardinal Passerini sat discussing in much distress of mind with Ippolito and Alessandro on the 19th May 1527, and Catherine certainly listened. And then their deliberations were broken in upon by Catherine's capable and loud-voiced aunt, Clarice, in the manner which we saw, and they were bidden to depart without delay from Florence. But not the little Duchessina, as Catherine was called, for while the rest, with their retainers, in the utmost confusion and terror, packed a few necessary things and made a hurried departure by the exit at the back of the palace into the Via de' Cinori, and while the mob, which had been for several hours collected in the Via Larga, began to pour in too and plunder the palace, she was ordered by the government to remain behind, to be kept as a prisoner of the Republic, who intended to use her as a valuable hostage in the case of future difficulties with Pope Clement. The terror suffered by a child of 8 thus kept behind in the midst of such a scene of confusion, in order to be immured amongst strangers as a prisoner, was naturally great, and we see what an impression it made upon Catherine by her conduct 3 years later, when bidden to leave the convent of the Murate. Thus did Catherine begin at an early age her apprenticeship to a trouble-tossed life. She was first sent to the convent of Ognissanti, and was kept there for 6 months. Thence she was removed suddenly by night, on the 7th December 1527, to the convent of Le Murate, on the opposite side of Florence, at the far end of the long Via Ghibellina, close under the walls of the city. The plague was at that time raging in Florence, and we read how this change of prison entailed on Catherine a long walk by night through the plague-stricken streets. The convent of Le Murate, the walled-up ones, was the most important convent in Florence, being that patronized by all those ladies of the principal Florentine families who took the veil, and here Catherine remained for nearly 3 years, until she was 11 years old. The chief points insisted upon in regard to her were, that she was to be kept in safe custody, that there was to be no communication allowed between her and any friends of her family in the city, and that her education was to be duly attended to. This point of Catherine's education is one much discussed in the correspondence of the time, and the nuns of the Murate certainly appear to have done their part well in this respect, for Catherine, though she left all compulsory education behind her at 14, was one of the most highly educated women of her day. The Murate also prided itself on its teaching of deportment and polite behavior, and in this respect, no less than in learning, Catherine in her after-life did the nuns credit, for almost every historian enlarges upon her pleasing and agreeable manners. It is in this time spent at the Murate that we have the first indications of Catherine's character. We are told, by various writers who deal with her life as a girl, of her kind and amiable ways, and this seems borne out by the fact that the nuns of the Murate, a convent where there were notably many discords, became extremely fond of her. And long afterwards we find Catherine on her side still cherishing kindly remembrances of them, and writing to them constantly in the most affectionate terms. In her letters, written more than 40 years later, when she was Queen Regent of France, she delights to recall the daily life of the convent, and the beautiful garden, with the Arno flowing near it, which she has not seen for all those years, and lapses into poetry as she speaks of the view looking up the river, saying, "Monti superbi, la cui fronte alpina fadisse contro I venti arginee sponda, valle beate, per cui d'onda in onda l'Arno con passo signoril cammina." Here Catherine spent the most peaceful time of her life, though even during it there were rough winds blowing round her outside the walls of the Murate, for it was felt that her death, as the last legitimate offspring of the elder branch of the Medici, was eminently desirable in the interests of the Republic. During nearly the whole of her last year at the convent, the city was being besieged by the army which her relative the Pope had sent against it, fighting took place almost daily, and as men's passions grew more inflamed in this fierce struggle between the Republic and its enemies, there were not wanting those who made various disgraceful proposals for getting rid of this heiress of the Medici family, and she was aware that her death was at any moment possible. Once during this period, a member of the Republican government proposed that she should be suspended in a basket from the walls as a target for the enemy's bullets, while another member, furious at Clement's conduct, suggested an even worse method of disposing of her. At last, in the summer of 1530, the government considered that Catherine was growing too popular at the Murate, and that through her presence there a feeling favorable to the Medici was growing up in this important convent, which might become a cause of inconvenient intrigues. They therefore decided to remove her to another abode. Accordingly, on the 20th July, in the middle of the night, the convent was aroused by a loud knocking at the main entrance, with a summons to open in the name of the Republic. The door being opened, there appeared 3 senators, the senior of whom, Salvestro Aldobrandini, presented an order to the frightened nuns to make over to them the girl, Catherine de Medici. A long parley followed, Catherine feeling certain that this meant that she was going to be put somewhere where her death could be effected, and protesting with all her might against being given up to them. At last it was urged by the nuns that she should, at any rate, be left alone until the morning, and this was at length conceded. As soon as the senators were gone, Catherine cut off all her hair, put on a dress of a nun of the Murate, and, going to the Mother Superior of the convent, said, "Will they dare now to remove me when they come in the morning, and to appear before the eyes of the people in the streets, employed in the crime of forcibly carrying off a nun from her convent?" In the morning, therefore, when the senators again arrived, with a horse for her to ride, Catherine appeared thus dressed before them, dared them to take her away, and refused to take off the dress she had assumed. For hours they argued, and every persuasion was tried without avail. Catherine was adamant. The horse brought for her remained standing at the door in the street. The struggle of wills continued within. At last they got her as far as the door of the convent, but there the senators said they could not take her thus dressed, and she declared that if she went at all she would go thus, and that nothing should induce her to change her dress. She refused, says Niccolini, with wonderful firmness and resolution, declaring that all the world should see that she was a nun being taken forcibly from her convent. In the end she prevailed, and they had to take her with them dressed as she was. They escorted her, presumably by the least frequented streets, to the convent of Santa Lucia in the Via San Gallo, and this, they informed her, was to be her new abode. The fact must have been a great relief to Catherine's mind. The first recorded action of Catherine's life showed that she was no ordinary child. Of a girl who could exhibit such force of character at the age of 11, it might safely be predicted that if she ever came to a position of independent power, she would manifest an ability and strength of character equal to that possessed by any of her ancestors. In connection with the same episode, we are also given a second indication of her character, for we are told that she felt lasting gratitude to Salvestro Aldobrandini for his behavior on this occasion, and the manner in which, though firm to his purpose, he had treated her with politeness and consideration. This she never forgot. More than 20 years afterwards, when their positions were reversed, she being then the powerful Queen of France, and Aldobrandini a proscribed heretic and outlaw, sentenced to death by the Pope, she exerted her influence and saved his life. We are told, "He escaped death through the intercession of the grateful Duchessina." Gratitude preserved so long and acted upon in this fashion is rare. The Murate still stands, though long since abolished as a convent, and still bears out its name by sheltering walled-up ones, for it is now the great prison of Tuscany. Its forbidding door in the center of the high, grim wall remains, as when Catherine and the senators of the Republic had there that contest of wills, and recalls the strange scene: the horse which had been waiting before the door for so many hours, the weeping nuns within the doorway, afraid that their little charge was being taken away to be murdered, the 3 senators striving to induce the latter to doff her offending attire, and in the midst the small figure in her black dress, with pale, determined face, whom not all their endeavors could shake. Catherine remained at the convent in the Via San Gallo during the remaining month of the siege, until in August 1530 the city surrendered to the Pope. It does not appear that in the terms of capitulation the Republican government made any use of the possession of this valuable prisoner, or, if they did so, the result became a dead letter, like so many other provisions of the treaty. As soon as she thus regained her liberty, Catherine flew back to her beloved nuns at the Murate, and remained there until the spring of the following year, 1531, when, it being obvious that she had better not continue to reside in a city to which Alessandro was going to be sent as supreme ruler, Clement VII sent for her again to Rome, which city she had left as a child of 6. There Catherine again met her cousin Ippolito, by this time a general favorite in Rome, and an attachment began to grow up between the girl of 12 and the young man of 22, which might in time have become something stronger had circumstances permitted it. Describing Catherine at this time in his reports, the Venetian ambassador at Rome, Antonio Suriano, says, "This child has a very lively disposition, and displays a charming wit. She owes her education to the care of the nuns of the Murate convent at Florence." The subject of Catherine's marriage now began to be debated at the papal court. Among the aspirants were the King of Scotland, the Duke of Mantua, and the Duke of Milan, while the mutual regard between Catherine and her cousin Ippolito also led some to talk of this as the best marriage for her. Infinitely better would it have been for Catherine had this been the alliance chosen, but, as already noted, Clement VII had other views, and by December 1532 he had privately concluded an arrangement with Francis I that Catherine should be married to that king's second son, Henry of Orleans. Her appearance at this time, when she was nearly 14, is described by the Venetian ambassador at Rome as "small and slender, with fair hair, thin and not pretty in face, but with the fine eyes peculiar to all the Medici." And he adds, "She has a remarkably kind, gentle, and cordial manner." The marriage being thus settled, all the arrangements for it were pushed on by the Pope as fast as possible. Catherine was allowed to return for a short time to Florence, where she stayed again at the Murate convent, the Medici palace being occupied by Alessandro, and was told to be ready to leave there at the end of August to meet the Pope at Nice, and accompany him thence to Marseilles, where the marriage was to take place in October. At this time we have an interesting glimpse of her from the contemporary painter and historian Vasari, who, when she was about to leave Florence never to see it again, writes thus: "She well deserves that we should wish to keep her portrait among us on account of her kind and amiable ways. Her sweetness of disposition cannot be painted, and of that my brush can secure us no memorial." These words will seem strange to those who have no other mental picture of Catherine de Medici than the traditional one. But they are written by Vasari in a private letter to an intimate friend, and she, who is thus spoken of, was removing permanently to a distant country where it was not probable that she would ever meet Vasari again. So that there is practically no doubt that these praises, attributing to her a character universally and deservedly liked, represent the truth. These words of Vasari, written under such circumstances, together with the reports of the Venetian ambassador at Rome, and the estimation in which she was held at the Murate, where she had so long been intimately known, leave no question as to what Catherine's character was like at the time when she arrived in France to be married to Henry of Orleans. Catherine left Florence on the 2nd September 1533, after giving a farewell banquet at the Medici Palace to all the noble ladies of Florence, at which, as a parting gift, they presented her with some splendid embroideries of pearls on cloth of gold. The banquet being over, she left the city at 3 o'clock, and rode to Poggio a Caiano, where the party slept the first night. She was accompanied to Marseilles by Maria Salviati, her father's first cousin, Caterina Cibo, Filippo Strozzi, and Palla Rucellai. The next day they rode on to Pistoia, and thence travelled to Porto Venere, on the Gulf of Spezia, where they embarked by sea for Marseilles, touching at Nice, where they met the Pope, and reaching Marseilles on the 12th October. The fleet as it approached the harbour of Marseilles was a picturesque sight. It consisted of 60 ships, that conveying Catherine having sails of purple cloth embroidered with gold, and being followed by that bearing the Pope, which was covered with a tent of cloth of gold, the deck being carpeted with crimson satin. On landing, a procession of unusual splendour took place through the city. It was headed by a white horse with white trappings, bearing the host, and led by 2 equerries also dressed in white. Then followed the Pope, conveyed in his chair borne on men's shoulders, and succeeded by a long procession of bishops and cardinals on horseback, wearing their robes, and lastly Catherine herself, dressed in a robe of gold brocade, and riding by the side of her uncle-in-law, John Stuart, Duke of Albany, who had married her mother's sister Anne. From every balcony hung costly draperies of velvet and embroidery, while across the streets were festooned countless garlands of the deep-coloured damask roses of Provence, mingled with the lilies of France. The 2 palaces occupied by the Pope and the King of France were separated by a street, over which was thrown a covered bridge, uniting the palaces, and made to form a large hall, which was hung with costly tapestries. In the Galleria degli Arazzi at Florence are to be seen 3 rooms hung with rich tapestries depicting the festivities held on the occasion of this marriage of Catherine. These furnish an interesting record of the costumes worn on this occasion. The marriage of Catherine de Medici and Henry of Orleans took place on the 28th of October 1533 in the Cathedral of Marseilles. The Pope himself performed the ceremony, and Catherine, who wore a dress of white silk embroidered with precious stones and ornaments of Florentine gold filigree work, had round her all the few relations she possessed, that is, the Pope, Ippolito, lately returned from Hungary, and dignified and courteous as ever, though clouded by that permanent sadness which had come over him, Maria Salviati and Caterina Cibo. Catherine was at this time in her 15th year, and Henry of Orleans 16. The latter was a dull, taciturn youth. The long and severe imprisonment which he and his elder brother had undergone in Spain, while it had ruined his brother's health, appeared in Henry to have had the effect of clouding his brains, and he was a complete contrast to his brilliant and energetic father, Francis I., to whom his second son's heavy and inert character was a constant cause of irritation and contempt. At this marriage Pope Clement presented 2 notable gifts, both of which have had a remarkable history. To Catherine herself he gave 7 splendid pearls of most unusual size, and these appear in her picture in the front of her crown. 25 years afterwards, Catherine gave these pearls to her daughter-in-law, Mary, Queen of Scots, when the latter married her eldest son, and Mr. Cochrane mentions that Mary is represented with them round her neck in a picture at Holyrood Palace. When Elizabeth put Mary to death, she not only took her life but also stole her jewels, seizing upon these celebrated pearls which she had always coveted. They thus became part of the English crown jewels. And after having assisted at many great historic functions, Their last public appearance was in the year 1901, when at his coronation His Majesty King Edward VII wore in his crown the celebrated pearls which Catherine de Medici had worn in hers. Clement's other present was given to the bride's father-in-law, Francis I, and was the well-known casket, made by Valerio Vicentino, assisted by his daughter, and carved from transparent rock crystal, depicting 24 scenes from the life of Christ, and lined with silver, so as to give an appearance of relief to the engraving. It contained the pyx, in which the Holy Sacrament was placed on the Thursday of Holy Week, the pyx being of fine enamel set with rubies. This casket was one of the most valuable presents given on that occasion, and Vicentino was paid 2,000 gold crowns for it, while its value is now priceless. In the 17th century it found its way back to Florence, and now stands amongst other gems which belonged to the Medici in the gem room of the Uffizi Gallery, though how it got back to Italy is a mystery. It was placed by Catherine, during her son Charles IX's reign, in a cabinet in the Louvre. Apparently it was stolen from the Louvre during the commotions in Paris after the death of Henry III, and the robber, feeling it unsafe to retain so remarkable an object in France, took it to Italy, where, after lying hidden for some 40 years, it must have been bought by one of the Medici Grand Dukes, most probably by Ferdinand II, as it suddenly appears in the catalogue of the Medici gems in 1635, but without any record of when or how it had been obtained. Having thus followed Catherine's history during the 14 years of her girlhood, we have next to look at her during the 14 years that she was the wife of the French king's son, and the 12 years following them, during which her husband and herself were King and Queen of France. Second period, 1533 to 1559. Francis I had many matters of diplomacy to discuss with the Pope, while there were also various grand festivities to be got through before either of them could leave Marseilles, so that it was a whole month before the King and the Pope parted. Then Clement VII, with all those who had accompanied him, again set sail for Italy, and Francis I, with his brilliant court and his new daughter-in-law, started by road for Avignon to return to his palace at Fontainebleau. Catherine now found herself in an entirely new kind of life. It was Francis's custom to be continually changing his residences, and the Venetian ambassador, Marino Giustiniano, who was ambassador to France from 1532 to 1535, says, "Never during my embassy did the court remain in the same place for more than 15 consecutive days." Catherine shared in these constant flittings, and by these journeyings from city to city, performed always on horseback, she in a very short time saw a large part of France. We now obtain accounts of what Catherine was like, both in appearance and character, from a new group of observers, that is, from a fresh set of Venetian ambassadors, those accredited to the court of France, and from those French writers who saw her at the court at this time. The former describe her as full of vivacity, affable, and distinguished in her manners, while the French writer Brantôme, who was then at the court, describing the new bride, says, "Her appearance is dignified, but at the same time gracious. Her expression is pleasing, and her taste in dress excellent. She has a fine figure, a white complexion, small feet, very well-shaped hands, and a particularly beautiful voice." We are also told that she rode remarkably well, was fond of an outdoor life, and had unusually good health. Francis I was himself brilliant and cultivated. Of him the Venetian ambassador Marino Cavalli says, "Listening to him one recognizes that there is neither study nor art which he cannot discuss with much knowledge. His attainments are not limited to war, but include also literature, painting, and the languages." Francis soon discovered that his new daughter-in-law was of a livelier wit and more highly educated than most of the ladies of his court, and that her bonhomie and cleverness made her an agreeable companion, while her love of hunting and other field sports chimed in with his own strong passion for the chase. So he insisted on her accompanying him on all occasions, and Catherine was soon admitted into the charmed circle of his petite bande, those sparkling and joyous spirits who, like a corps of feminine aides-de-camp, accompanied Francis in his progresses from palace to palace, from forest-encircled Fontainebleau to his proud castle of Amboise by the silvery Loire, where Catherine's father and mother had been married soon after Francis succeeded to the throne, and from his sumptuous palace of Les Tournelles in Paris to what is now to us tragedy-haunted Blois, but whose richly decorated chambers then resounded with the laughter and espièglerie of the petite bande. This friendship on the part of the king, though a valuable help to Catherine in her new and difficult position, and especially when 3 years later her enemies found a heavy charge to bring against her, naturally tended to arouse court jealousy. However, Catherine was wise enough to bear herself with proper humility, knowing well how many causes for dissatisfaction the French had against her. We see a glimpse of these latter in the report of the Venetian ambassador Giustiniano about this time, which says, "Monsieur d'Orléans is married to Madame Catherine de Medici, which dissatisfies the entire nation. It is thought that Pope Clement deceived the king in this alliance. However, his niece is very submissive." But except for the French king himself, Catherine had not a friend in France, and her position was most difficult. Not only was the marriage highly unpopular with both nobles and people, and she herself hated as a bourgeoise Italian long before the French had even seen her, but added to this her relative Pope Clement had increased the feeling against her by failing to keep his promises. At Marseilles, Catherine had been talked of as bringing to the French crown 3 rings, Genoa, Milan, and Naples. But Clement, when once the marriage was effected and he had got back to Italy, had done nothing to assist the French crown to gain any one of these dominions. And when in the following year, 1534, the Pope died, and Catherine was left without even such support as he afforded her, the feeling against her became intensified. Nor was this all. To these misfortunes on public grounds was added a more private one. Catherine's husband, Henry, at that time a dull, sheepish, and gloomy youth of whom his father could make nothing, and who on his return from his captivity in Spain 3 years before had forgotten his own language, disliked her from the first, her brilliancy and cleverness only making his own want of ability the more noticeable. So that the prospect before Catherine was not a bright one: in a foreign country, disliked by her husband, hated by the French nation, despised as a low-born foreigner, and with enemies all around watching for an opportunity of bringing some charge against her which would enable France to get rid of her. In 1535, 2 years after her marriage, Catherine heard of the tragic death of her cousin Ippolito, basely poisoned by the hated Alessandro. It must have been a severe blow to her, as he was not only a cousin to whom she was much attached, but also almost her last living relative. Seldom has anyone been left at her age so absolutely alone in the world. Her aunt Clarice, her father's only sister, was long since dead, her distant relative Pope Clement had died in the previous year, and now her only cousin, Ippolito, being also gone, she had no living relations at all, except her father's first cousin, Maria Salviati, who after Catherine's marriage had practically retired from the world. Catherine's isolated state in this respect naturally much increased the difficulty of her position, as she was thus without that powerful support of influential relations which others in like cases have generally possessed. So that this girl of 16, confronted by so many adverse conditions, had nothing but her own ability and strength of character upon which to depend. In August 1536, when she had been married nearly 3 years, Her husband's elder brother, the Dauphin Francis, who, ever since his harsh confinement in Spain as a boy, had continued in weak health, died suddenly at Tournon. This death of his eldest son was a terrible blow to Francis I, all whose affection was centered on the Dauphin. On hearing at Lyons that he was ill, the king at once prepared to go to him, when, just as he was starting, came the news of his death. And we have a vivid picture drawn of the king's grief, and of how on receiving the terrible news he knelt at the window of his palace before the whole people, who deeply sympathized with him, and prayed for his son, for his people, and for himself. It was of course immediately said by almost the whole nation that the Dauphin Francis had been poisoned by the Italian woman in order that her husband might become the heir to the throne. There has never been found a single particle of foundation for the charge, and every historian considers it was simply due to the national prejudice against Catherine. The accusation was not even based on unpopularity arising from any conduct of her own, for she had been too short a time in France, and too little prominent publicly to be much known by the people. However, the charge was investigated. The Dauphin's cupbearer, Montecuculli, was accused of having been the agent, and was tortured to make him reveal by whom he had been employed to commit the crime asserted; and under torture, so far from implicating Catherine in any way, he declared the Emperor Charles V to have been the author of the crime, and adhered to this even at his execution. It is, however, believed that this was almost certainly equally untrue, and it has been pointed out that a dubious testimony uttered under the anguish of torture is far less credible than the cause assigned by the most unprejudiced historians, that is, that the Dauphin, who was of a sickly constitution, died of having drunk too freely of cold water after overheating himself at tennis, and not of poison at all. In any case, there is admitted to have been no ground for the accusation against Catherine. But when a prejudice once exists, everything that occurs strengthens it, and even the result of Montecuculli's trial did not cause the people to lay aside their suspicion against her. Francis I, however, in spite of his grief, did not share this view, and after the death of the Dauphin lavished every kindness upon her, as though desiring to compensate for the unjust suspicion of his subjects. This event changed very materially Catherine's position and prospects. Hitherto, she and her husband had had no higher destiny to anticipate than that of becoming Duke and Duchess of Milan or some similar state, whenever the contest between Francis I and Charles V should come to an end. Now, however, they would in due course become King and Queen of France. But this, though it promoted Catherine to a higher dignity and greater importance at the French court than hitherto, by no means improved her position in other ways. For the wound given to the French by her marriage, grievous when she was merely marrying the second son of their king, was greatly increased by her now becoming the Dauphine, wife of the heir to the throne. Each year seemed to bring some fresh increase to the difficulties of Catherine's position and the sorrow of her lot. When in the first year after the marriage Pope Clement, her chief bulwark against French disfavor, died, when again in the following year the cousin she had been fond of was murdered and she was left alone in the world, and when again in the third year the French people persisted in accusing her of having poisoned her brother-in-law, notwithstanding every evidence of her innocence, each of these things added yet another drop to a cup which was an unusually bitter one to be drunk by a girl of 17. And now there began a still harder trial, one which was to last for 20 years. About the year 1540, when he was 22, her taciturn young husband Henry fell completely under the dominion of Diane de Poitiers, the beautiful widow of the Seneschal of Normandy. She ruled him entirely, becoming the leader of the party of the Dauphin at the court, in opposition to the party of the king, which was led by the Duchesse d'Étampes, while Catherine had to stand aside and see herself put in every way in the background, openly insulted by Diane de Poitiers, who took every opportunity of showing her affronts, and neglected by Henry, who spent most of his time at Diane's great estate of Annay. Catherine bore it in silence and with excellent tact, which was remarked upon with approval even by Francis I, who was greatly irritated by his son's treatment of her. But the way the iron entered into her soul is disclosed by her letters long afterwards to her favourite daughter, in one or two touching allusions to this sorrow borne for years in silence. About this time a fashionable craze for Protestantism set in at the French court. One outcome of this was a passion for Marot's French psalms, and each person was to be heard singing his or her favourite one on all occasions. We are told that Catherine took a particular affection for the one beginning Vers l'Éternel des oppressés le Père, which was forever on her lips, and no doubt appealed to her in consequence of her husband's coldness and neglect, and the prejudice against her evinced by the French people. The portrait of Catherine painted at this time, when she was 21 years of age, is that which has always been the picture of her preserved in her own family. Though not possessing beauty, she has a fine, intelligent face, with the Medici eyes, a broad forehead, and fair hair, the picture thus agreeing exactly with the descriptions of her given by Suriano, Vasari, and others at this time. This portrait of her was permanently kept by the Medici family with their other family portraits in their principal villa of Poggio a Caiano, where it and they still hang. The villa and its contents passed from the Medici Grand Dukes to their successors, the Austrian Grand Dukes, and from the latter to the King of Italy, being now the royal villa in Tuscany. Although the painter's name has been lost, the crown, the historic pearls, the agreement with the descriptions of contemporary writers, and above all the locality in which the portrait has always been preserved, leave no doubt as to its authentic character. Painted for Catherine in France by an Italian artist, it was most probably sent by her as a present to her relative, Cosimo I, at the time of his marriage in 1539 to Eleonora di Toledo. In 1542 another trouble came upon Catherine. Now 23, she had been married for 9 years, and had no children. This was not only the sorrow it would in any case have been, but also it increased very materially the opportunity of those who had always desired to see her put away, and the slur upon the honour of France removed. Diane de Poitiers did not fail to find here another occasion for wounding the neglected wife whom she hated. This she did by making a sneering allusion to Francis I on the subject, in the hearing of those who, she knew, would repeat it to Catherine. This was followed by a sort of family conclave, at which the matter was formally discussed, and at this Diane, strange to say, was also present, and deliberately urged upon the king that Catherine ought to be divorced, to which Francis I was reported to have agreed, as being inevitable. At this time only one person showed any kindness to Catherine. Moved by pity for the many things she had to bear, Marguerite of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, Francis I's deservedly beloved sister, wrote to Catherine to comfort her, telling her, "My brother will never allow this repudiation, as evil tongues pretend." Reassured by this sympathy, Catherine went to Francis I and offered to resign her husband and enter a convent, if he willed it. The Venetian ambassador Lorenzo Contarini, in his report, says, "She went to the king, and with many tears told him she had heard it was his Majesty's intention to give his son another wife, and as it had not yet pleased God to bestow on her the grace of having children, it was proper that as soon as his Majesty found it undesirable to wait longer, he should provide for the succession to so great a throne, that, for her part, considering the great obligation she was under to his Majesty, who had deigned to accept her as a daughter-in-law, she was much more disposed to endure this affliction than to attempt to oppose his will." Francis bade her have no fear, and assured her that he would not allow her to be put away. And in the following year this particular trouble was removed from Catherine by the birth of a son, born at Fontainebleau, who was named Francis after his grandfather. Between 1543 and 1555 she had 10 children. 3 of these died in infancy, but of the remaining 7, 4 were sons, 3 of whom, Francis, Charles, and Henry, in turn sat on the throne of France, and 3 daughters, Elizabeth, who married Philip II of Spain, Claude, who married the Duke of Lorraine, and Marguerite, who married Henry of Navarre. In 1547, when Catherine was 28 and had been married 14 years, Francis I died, and her husband became Henry II of France. This intensified for Catherine both of the evils which she had borne so long in prudent and dignified silence, but with an aching heart. The supposed insult to France in her person, great at her marriage, and greater still when she became the Dauphine, seemed to the French greatest of all now that she was Queen of France. Consequently, her unpopularity with the people became more pronounced than ever. But still more than this did Henry's exaltation to the throne increase that which was the chief sorrow of Catherine's life. Henry was now 29, and no longer dull and stupid as he had been as a youth. Though often given to depression, and fonder of hunting and pleasure than of attending to the affairs of his kingdom, his character had strengthened and improved, and Catherine secretly loved him intensely, though he did not in the least return her affection. It is the opinion of all authorities that the one real passion of Catherine's life was for Henry, but he himself, stated by one of the Protestant writers of the time to be intoxicated by that baggage, Diane, never either appreciated it or was even aware of it. And his accession began the great triumph of Diane de Poitiers, the beautiful huntress, she whom Jean Goujon has sculptured, nude and triumphant, embracing with marble arms a mysterious stag, enamored like Leda's swan, Diane de Poitiers, the wondrous woman of eternal youth, the elderly Alcina, who, to charm a youthful Roger, has discovered the fountain of youth, Diane de Poitiers, whom Primaticcios frescoes at Fontainebleau sometimes represent as the luminous queen of night, and sometimes as a sombre Hecate surrounded by eternal fires. Henry's accession to the throne gave opportunity to Diane to show all her power over him, and this in a manner which in no other age or country would have been possible. Though she was 48 and Henry only 29, his infatuation for her was such that he entirely resigned to her both himself and his kingdom, a surrender so complete that his contemporaries credited Diane with the possession of an enchanted ring or some other magic power. We are not in a natural world. This is an enchantment, and it can only be carried out by violent spells and dramatic strokes. The Armida of 50 years who holds a king of 30 in bonds must daily use her magic wand. Henry exalted fidelity to her into a virtue. All his leisure hours were spent with her, and at her estate at Annay, in thickets of myrtle and roses, amidst statues, fountains, and gushing springs, in the depths of dark and game-abounding forests, the king leads an enchanted existence. Catherine had none of those attractions which her rival so potently possessed. Her charms were those of intellect only, and though these had been strong enough to greatly please her husband's capable father, Francis I, they had no power to attract the duller nature of Henry. Thus there now began for Catherine a 12 years' torment, self-repression being her hourly task. Diane de Poitiers, created by Henry Duchess of Valentinois, practically ruled all things. At Henry's coronation she occupied the chief place. Even the special taxes levied on the accession of a new king were bestowed upon her. She disposed of all offices, both secular and ecclesiastical. She absorbed lands and wealth in every direction. While Catherine was left to live at the gloomy castle of Chaumont, Diane's splendid residences of Annay and Chenonceau were made by her almost regal in magnificence. The Guises, the 6 sons of Claude, Duke of Guise, at this time her faithful vassals, were promoted to all the chief offices in the kingdom, and no meeting of his council was attended by Henry until he had first discussed with Diane the matters to be brought before it. While such was the position with regard to Henry and Diane, Catherine the Queen had to lead a retired, self-contained existence, making herself as little obtrusive as possible, careful over every word and look, lest she should give opportunity to those who watched for grounds on which she might be accused of some crime and got rid of. She had to see her ability shrouded and given no opportunity for exercise, her rightful position usurped by a woman 20 years older than herself, and far less talented, her birth and family scorned and ridiculed, her advice never sought by her husband, and herself despised and insulted by a court and people who took their cue from him. Moreover, Diane de Poitiers delighted in devising constant slights and veiled insults against the Italian woman, while perhaps more galling still was her insisting, when Catherine's children were born, in installing herself as head nurse, and, as M. Georges Giffray says, monopolizing the candles and setting all questions regarding the newly born, taking entire management of everything, nursing Catherine, receiving letters from the court physicians complimenting her upon her care over the Queen, and from Henry a salary on account of the good, praiseworthy, and agreeable services she hath rendered to our dear and much-loved companion the Queen. And yet, when Catherine's son Charles was born, 1550, Henry left the Queen 3 days after his son's birth and went to stay at Annay with Diane, an act which even in those days was considered an unexampled breach of royal etiquette. The above shows us a state of things such as could have occurred only in France, and at that period. At first sight we are inclined to wonder how Catherine could have endured all this. But that which caused its chief bitterness was at the same time that which enabled her to endure it, that is, that through it all she had a strong passion of love for her husband. It was this which caused Catherine to endure all these things without showing a sign. Strange as this fact may seem, we have it vouched for by 2 unimpeachable witnesses, that is, by those observant onlookers, the Venetian ambassadors, and by her own letters years afterwards. The ambassador Contarini writes, "At the opening of the reign, the Queen could not endure this love of the King for the Duchess, but later, by reason of the urgent prayers of the King, she resigned herself, and now she bears it with patience." It was because Catherine loved Henry so strongly, and knew that the only way by which she could retain even such small portion of his regard as she possessed was to endure uncomplainingly all that such a position entailed, that she patiently, and without ever once reproaching him, bore for 12 years a combination of exasperating mortifications such as would have driven most women into furious resentment. In the latter case the court would have been turned into the same state of disgraceful turmoil as resulted when, about 60 years later, the same conditions caused Marie de Medici to resent the conduct of her husband, Henry IV. The behavior of a weak character, when placed in such circumstances, is exemplified by Marie, that of a strong one by Catherine, and severe though the trial was, the latter reaped her reward, not only in the respect which she earned from many for the manner in which she bore it, as well as the satisfaction to herself in preserving the court from scenes similar to those afterwards witnessed in Marie's case, but also in retaining a certain portion of her husband's regard. And there is considerable dignity in the way in which, years afterwards, she makes, in writing to her eldest daughter Elizabeth, then Queen of Spain, the only direct mention of this trial which she ever permitted to pass her lips, as well as in the terms in which on another occasion she wrote to reprove her son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, for his infidelities to his wife. At the time when the regency of the kingdom had just devolved upon her, and when she was oppressed by many heavy cares, She writes to her daughter Elizabeth about 2 years after the latter's marriage as follows: "Mamie, commend yourself very much to God, for you have seen me in former days as contented as you are now, and believing that I should never have any trouble but this one, that I was not loved in the way I wished by the king, your father, who doubtless honored me beyond my deserts, but I loved him so much that I was always afraid of offending him, as you know well enough. And now God has taken him from me. Therefore think of me, and let me serve as a warning to you not to trust too much in the love of your husband." Writing towards the end of her life to Henry of Navarre, she says, "My son, I was never in my life so dumbfounded as when I heard the words which Frontenac has been reporting everywhere as being those which you ordered him to convey to your wife. You are not, I know, the first husband who is young, and not too wise in such matters, but I believe that you are the first, and the only one, who after such events would venture on such language to his wife. I had the honor of marrying the king, my lord and your sovereign, whose daughter you have married, but the thing which vexed him most in the world was after he found out that I knew about such doings." These letters shed a flood of light on Catherine's character. But apart from this, the 2 allusions to Henry II which they contain show very plainly why it was that Catherine deliberately endured in silence for 12 years the heavy trial which has been mentioned, and at the same time how deeply she felt it, since the memory of it remained with her so many years afterwards. But Diane de Poitiers did not confine herself to affronts in connection with private matters. From 1552 to 1558 France was at war both in Germany and Italy, and when Henry proceeded on the German campaign, Diane contrived a severe public indignity to Catherine by persuading him not to give the regency during his absence to the Queen, though this course had always been the usual in such cases. The insult was the more severe in that Catherine was by far the most capable person at the court. That she felt it severely we know both from her letters and her speech on the occasion, while it did her the greatest harm with the people, lowering her greatly in their estimation and increasing their long-standing contempt for her. Nevertheless, when, on Henry's departure to the war, the order communicating this decision was read to her, we are informed by a letter from a friend at the court to the Constable Montmorency, that she only smiled, and said that though it had pleased the king not to give her this authority which His Majesty Francis I gave on a similar occasion to his mother, Louise, and though she would have used it well had he done so, yet it was not her intention to ask him to redress the wrong. Only, she said, she would prefer not to have the order published, lest it should lower her reputation with the people. No wonder that those who heard her words, and saw her receive such an affront in such a manner, marvelled openly at her wonderful self-control. Such, then, was the trial which lasted through so large a portion of Catherine's life. And it was this severe ordeal, involving through so many years a daily and almost hourly exercise of self-control, which both tested and formed her character. She was only 20 when this trial began, and had shown by her history as a girl that she possessed her full share of that tendency to emotion natural to one of Italian blood. Thus for her to learn self-control was more difficult than for women of northern race, like Elizabeth of England or Jeanne d'Albret of France. Nevertheless, through the long discipline of 20 years, she grew from an emotional girl into a woman in whom the power of self-control was so developed that it amazed all who saw it in exercise. Those who looked merely on the surface saw only indifference, or in some cases duplicity, while it is, of course, possible to argue that all self-control is duplicity. But to those who saw deeper, as it is plain from their reports that some of the Venetian ambassadors did, the real character was evident enough. And the combination of the endurance displayed, the motive for which the trial was submitted to, and the dignified manner in which the burden was borne irresistibly impress us. It is necessary to notice, in view of the traditional idea regarding her, that during the whole of this portion of her life, that is, up to the age of 40, there are no tales of crimes alleged against Catherine de Medici. Ground for such a charge was the very thing for which her numerous enemies watched in order to get her divorced, but they never were able to produce any. All the charges of that kind relate to the period of her life after she was 40. At last, in August 1557, when Catherine was 38, she had her first opportunity of showing her abilities. During the absence of the king in Champagne, the main French army under the Constable Montmorency was totally defeated at the Battle of St. Quentin by Emmanuel Philibert, who in 1553 had succeeded his father as Duke of Savoy. Montmorency himself was taken prisoner. Northern France was left completely defenseless. Spain was jubilant at this crushing defeat of the French arms, and the general panic took place in Paris. In this time of national emergency it was not Diane de Poitiers, though her ascendancy over all affairs of the kingdom was still continuing, who came to the front, but Catherine, Diane being as helpless in the crisis as everyone else. The disaster was stupendous. History has related what were our losses, immense, unheard of since Pavia. The first shock of the news was overwhelming. France was stunned by the blow. Already Paris believed the enemy within the walls and the realm captured. In the capital the citizens packed their possessions and fled, some to Orléans, some to Bourges, some still further. To stop the flight, to rouse energy, to sound in the ears of France those words able to arouse the dead, "The country in danger," this was the imperative duty of whoever governed. But the king was absent, only the queen was in Paris. What did the queen? I leave the Venetian ambassador to reply. Giacomo Soranzo, the Venetian ambassador at that time, in his report of the 14th August 1557, relates that Catherine at once went to the Parlement, urged on them not to lose heart, as they were ready to do, but to vigorously prosecute the war, and to vote large subsidies for the defense of the kingdom; and she showed so much courage, wisdom, and ability, that she was not only completely successful, but received an immense ovation from the members of the Parlement. She expressed herself with so much eloquence and feeling that she touched all hearts; and the assembly concluded amidst such applause for her majesty, and such lively marks of satisfaction at her conduct, as cannot be described in words. All over the city nothing is talked about but the queen's prudence, and the happy way in which she acted in this undertaking. Thus did Catherine, on the first occasion in which she had an opportunity of showing her powers, overcome, for a time at all events, the prejudice which the French people had nourished against her for so many years. Her action gave all the more surprise because it was so little expected. Catherine de Medici by this act raised the veil of unconcern with politics to which the force of circumstances had until now condemned her. It was the first hour of her initiative, the first evidence of that personality which she was later on to raise to so high a degree. She revealed herself as queen, and gave evidence to the Parisians that the blood of the nation had become her own blood. Nor was it only in the French people that Catherine, by the qualities which she showed in this her first public action, produced a change of opinion regarding herself. Henry was greatly impressed with her conduct on this occasion, and after the episode entirely changed his mode of behaviour towards her, henceforth during the remaining 2 years of his life treating her on all occasions with marked respect. During the 12 years of her life as queen, Catherine, shut out from state affairs, found her main occupation in the education of her children. This she undertook almost entirely herself, and the manner in which she performed it was considered by those around her to show a laudable example of devoted attention and good sense. Her sons, who all inherited, in a more pronounced degree, their father's want of ability, soon passed under other instructors, but her 3 daughters, Elizabeth, born 1545, Claude, born 1547, and Marguerite, born 1553, were taught entirely by Catherine herself. With her 3 young daughters, Catherine also brought up Mary, Queen of Scots, who, born in 1542 and brought to France at the age of 5, was the eldest of the 4 girls. The list of the various translations, essays, and exercises set them by Catherine is still to be seen, and shows how thorough was her teaching and how wide its range. To the little Mary she dictates the following to be translated by her into Latin. The true grandeur and excellence of a prince, my very dear sister, does not consist in honors, in gold, in purple, and other luxuries of fortune, but in prudence, wisdom, and knowledge. And by so much as the prince wishes to differ from his people in his mode and fashion of living, by so much should he be removed from the foolish opinions of the vulgar. Adieu, and love me as much as you can. It is strange to remember that at the very time that Catherine was teaching Mary these principles, Diane de Poitiers was taking every opportunity to teach the latter to despise her as la fille de marchand. Catherine's daughters were brought up with exceeding strictness, Catherine being all her life a very great stickler for les convenances. It is extraordinary to note from their letters how greatly her children admired her, and how much they thought of it when they won her praise. This was not confined to one, but is common to them all. Her favorite daughter was the eldest, Elizabeth; the youngest, Marguerite, she who afterwards proved such a thorn to her husband, was the most troublesome even at that age, and in her letters she tells us so, and that at times she had even to be beaten. But she admired her mother just as much as did the rest. The last year of Henry II's reign was a time of important marriages and festivities, pageants and fêtes in connection therewith such as Henry loved. On the 24th April 1558, Catherine's eldest son Francis was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, both of them being 15 years of age. This wedding was arranged on the grandest scale, with every accessory that could aid picturesque effect. A gallery hung with vine branches laden with grapes was constructed from the bishop's palace to the door of the cathedral of Notre Dame, in front of which was placed the royal dais, and as the brilliant cortege approached the dais, heralds flung gold and silver among the crowd until they had to desist owing to the scramble for it creating so great a disturbance. The young bride, dressed all in white and looking like a lily, and wearing a crown blazing with diamonds, sapphires, and emeralds, took her place under the portico where the marriage ceremony was performed by the Archbishop of Rouen, the wedding ring being handed to him by the king, who drew it from his own finger. After which mass was celebrated inside the cathedral, the bride and bridegroom occupying a throne under a canopy of cloth of gold. In the evening there was a ball at the palace of Les Tournelles, combined with masks and mummeries in the Palais de Justice, at which the children of the Dukes of Guise and Aumale rode on artificial horses caparisoned with gold and silver trappings, and drawing coaches filled with gorgeously dressed pilgrims. These were followed by 6 ships covered with crimson velvet, and imitating as they moved the rolling motion of the sea, in the foremost of which embarked the king and the young bride, in the next the Dauphin and Catherine, in the third the Duke of Lorraine and the Princess Claude, and so on, the ships then sailing round the great hall, which was illuminated as much by the blaze of jewels worn by the company as by the torches and cressets. This was followed a year later by the 2 marriages, in June 1559, of Henry's sister Marguerite to Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, and of his and Catherine's eldest daughter Elizabeth, then 14, to Philip II of Spain, this later marriage being by proxy. The pageants and fêtes in connection with these two marriages went on for many days, and concluded with a grand tournament held in front of the palace of Les Tournelles on the 30th of June, in which the king himself took part, and which was witnessed by 4 queens, Catherine, her daughter Elizabeth, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Marguerite. Catherine's celebrated astrologer, Gaurico, had some time before predicted that Henry would be fatally wounded in a duel at the age of 40, and had repeated this prediction a week before the tournament, and Catherine had grave fears about Henry's taking part in the contest, and endeavoured to dissuade him from doing so, but he was bent upon it. As he rode into the lists, a boy in the crowd cried out, "Sire, do not tilt!" But no one paid any attention to it, nor did the boy himself, when afterwards interrogated, know why he had been moved to cry out. After several courses in which Henry was victorious, he sent Catherine a message that he would try one more bout for love of her. He did so. His opponent Montgomery's lace pierced Henry's eye, and, to the horror of the whole assemblage, the king fell from his horse mortally wounded. He was at once carried into the Tournelle palace, lingered for 10 days in great agony, and then died. On this terrible conclusion to the tournament, the greatest confusion pervaded the court, while, as soon as it was known that the king was in a dying state, all public affairs were thrown into the utmost disorder. In this emergency the queen came forward as alone having the right to assume the management of affairs, and her first exercise of authority was to order the Duchess of Valentinois to depart to her own house. But Catherine never at any time during her life showed a revengeful spirit, and upon Henry's death she allowed Diane de Poitiers to retain possession of her magnificent chateau of Anet, contenting herself with forbidding her the court, and requiring Diane to resign her other chateau of Chenonceaux in exchange for that castle of Chaumont, which Catherine never desired to see again. Catherine's grief at Henry's death was immense. For several days she would not speak, and when the Venetian ambassador came to condole with her, he says that she received him in a room of which both walls and floor were all covered with black, as well as everything in the room, while she herself could scarcely speak to him. From this time forth she always wore heavy mourning and a widow's veil, and adopted a new motto, Lacrymae hinc, hinc dolor. Nor was this grief simulated. All writers have considered that in these various signs of grief there was no pretence. She who for so many years had so hidden her feelings that many declared her to have none, could not hide them now. She had lost the one love of her life, a blow felt all the more because the man whom she thus mourned had never known how much she loved him, nor returned her affection, and for a time she shut herself up with her grief in an impenetrable silence. Thus ended Catherine's married life at the age of 40. We have now to see her in a new role, one in which the powers and abilities which had so long been allowed no exercise were at last to have full scope.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.